Yes, you really are looking at a grey background and not a lot else. And you might be thinking, why? Well, I'm about to tell you. Imagine the year is 1997 because this is what you would probably have been looking at. Yes, you really are looking at a grey background and not a lot else. And you might be thinking, why? Well, I'm about to tell you. Imagine the year is 1997 because this is what you would probably have been looking at. And 1997 wasn't a particularly special year for Linux, but it was still very much in its infancy, but not enough that various companies of a commercial nature could start up and produce software and configure software that was appealing not just for the home enthusiasts and hobbyists, but also for those people in the business world who were perhaps looking to adopt Linux, especially if they were coming from a Unix background. But Red Hat back then were trying to cater for both businesses and home users. And since Linux doesn't have any one particular user interface, there are a multitude of different desktops and window managers. Red Hat therefore had a very unique challenge on their hands in trying to come up with something that would be familiar to those two camps of users. What they came up with was a configuration framework written for the fvwm window manager called AnotherLevel. Now, what's interesting about AnotherLevel is that it's written in a language called M4. And for those of you who may have fond or not so fond memories of configuring sendmail back in the day, that's the configuration language that you will have used. And so I imagine that you can probably tell those class of users by the lack of hair on their head because they've probably torn it out trying to get the blasted thing to work. And so this is what that looks like. And I'm not at all familiar with M4. I wouldn't even want to try, but essentially it is a programming language that they have used to programmatically create fvwm configuration commands that can then be run. So the challenge that Red Hat had is how are they going to appeal to these users? Well, they did that by looking at those people that were coming from Unix and those that were coming from Windows. And in the Unix world, the dominant window manager then was probably the Motif window manager, or MWM. And this is very stylistic of the Motif window manager. Very blocky borders, very well defined buttons, and not much else. You can resize the window at either corner. You can minimize or iconify a window onto the root desktop, and that was pretty much it. Very few bells and whistles. But the unique thing about this is that the fvwm window manager allowed for that style to be readily available because that's what the window manager itself was modeled on originally, was that style of windows. And there isn't a great deal to what you can do. There may well have been some more icons in these menus, but I was unable to find those. But for example, you would have used this by creating a wharf, and in doing that, that gets rid of the pager down here, but you can see that there's a clock and a few other things that I'm able to do. not particularly modern looking by today's standard, but very functional. And there are still some people to this day who quite like this style, myself included. However, I said before that there are other themes, if you like, and that happens to be in the form of the Windows 95 look, which I'll switch to in a minute. And as that starts to load up, we can now see that there's a taskbar down here, which is perhaps more familiar to what would have been Windows 95 users, but perhaps not as functional. And again, it's the same menu that we just saw there. Again, I can minimize these, I can interact with them down here. There appears to be no context menu, although I do get the ident module telling me all the information about that window if I so choose. So you might think, well, what's the big deal? This is all pretty boring. But the thing you have to remember is that this window manager we're looking at here was the epitome of customization. If you had the time and, in this case, programming acumen, the sky's the limit as to what you could do with this. So much so that fvwm for quite a while back in the mid to late 90s was the default window manager that most Linux distributions offered out of the box. Now, around about this time, the likes of GNOME 1, KDE 1, possibly KDE 2 at this point, were about, but they were not as established. And so I think it's very easy for people to look at older technologies, such as this window manager, and think that it's had its day because it's old. It wasn't written within the last 5 years. It's not using the modern programming language of the day, and therefore people pass it by. But everything that you see here, the style, the building blocks, the things that you can do, they're all things that many other window managers since then have built upon. There are lots and lots of window managers and to some extent desktop environments that are either directly descended from the actual code base of this window manager, or indeed have just implemented certain features or cribbed some of the code from to actually get an idea about how to work around certain bugs. So we should not make this window manager fall into abeyance because of that. I think it should be heralded. And the nice thing about the AnotherLevel framework is that it was limited to Red Hat, unfortunately, but it got overlooked because of that in some ways, mostly because I think the ingenuity around how they went about creating this framework was very much ahead of its time. We have since had the now abandoned fvwm themes config framework, but that was written using Perl, which, again, looking back on it now, was the right choice because that was the de facto scripting language, and certainly it's a step up from M4. And the more I gaze at it here now, the less inclined I am to think that it was a good idea in the first place, but clearly it was used a lot at the time, so we shouldn't do it too much of a disservice there. But even then, Perl, as I was saying, by today's standards, is quite archaic. So I think users of the desktop in 1997 would have been, oddly enough, quite at home with this particular theme here. And indeed, for me, that was the first introduction I ever had to fvwm, was using the AnotherLevel framework. But for whatever reason, that booted up into the Motif window manager style, and that's the thing that I've preferred ever since, not even realising or knowing anything about it at that point. So that's really all I wanted to cover, was that particular point. I think there's a lot to be learnt from how we interact with the desktop now, and how a lot of these minimalist window managers have come about, particularly in the tiled window manager space, where screen real estate is considered king, and the minimalist approach is what drives people's interaction, and that makes complete sense to me. But don't forget that it was here from the very beginning with this framework. In fact, this framework was so popular that somebody in Manchester in the UK, John Latham, I think, created AnotherLevel Up, which was the successor to this configuration framework. He put a lot of time and effort into maintaining it, making it more generic, taking it out of RedHat, and making that runnable across different Linux distributions. But again, that's now mostly fallen into the historical curio camp, because I don't believe anyone is using it anymore. So that's my quick look at a little bit of fvwm history, and I hope you liked it.